Hello, this is Rob, and welcome to the North Country History with Rob Burg Podcast. Today is our last episode of Season 2, episode number 15, and you're going to follow along with me as I recap my 2025 podcast tour that took place July 31 to August 16th. So it's been not quite a month since the finish of it, and after finishing up the rest of the episodes, I wanted to kind of go through and give you all a glimpse of what I experienced on what to me was an epic journey of northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, and northeastern Minnesota. So we'll listen to that here next. So let's settle in, sit back, and enjoy the show. North Country History with Rob Burg, your podcast on the forest history of the Great Lakes region. When I planned my 2-week vacation from my day job, I wanted to look for something that I could do that would help to expand the podcast. This was unfortunately is not my full-time gig anymore. I don't do history full-time, but it is my side project. And I decided that for my vacation time, I did last year in October a 1-week vacation going out to the Northeast and covered some of that in podcast episodes. This time around, I had 2 weeks that I could take off together, and I wanted to fully devote it to the podcast and to get some ideas for future episodes, do some research, explore topics further along the way. And the resulting plans that I did was to do a 2-week trip going up through the Northern Lower Peninsula of Michigan, crossing over the Big Mac, the Mackinac Bridge, into the Upper Peninsula, doing a few days in the UP, and then heading west into Wisconsin, and then upwards into Minnesota. And along the way, I would meet people. I would explore new places, revisit some places I've been to before, and really get into that whole North Country experience that I try to share with you all, and the history of the North Country, in particular the forests of the Great Lakes region. And I think I came up with some pretty good places to go to, and the results of that is going to be almost the entire next season, Season 3, which will kick off in January of 2026, and it will be mostly the episodes will mostly be on what I covered on this podcast tour. So I want to recap a little bit of what I did along on the tour, and so give you kind of a little taste of what will be coming in 2026. And also for those of you who have to be armchair travelers, you can get a little bit of that experience that I had as well. And at some point, I'll have good video quality, or actually better Wi-Fi, so I can upload videos, and I'll be able to share them more on the Facebook page and on the YouTube channel. But at least right now, it's audio on the podcast. So anyways, so I started my vacation on July 31, and the first stop was the small community of Frederick, Michigan. It's in the Northern Lower Peninsula. If you look at a map and you see where Grayling is on I-75, just north of where US 127 merges into to I-75, and just a little bit further north of Grayling is Frederick. Now, I lived in this area for 18 years. I lived most of the time in Grayling, and then the last 5 years of my time, 2011 to 2016, I lived in Frederick. And I lived there while I was working for the Michigan History Museum's field sites, Hartwick Pines Logging Museum at Hartwick Pines State Park, the CCC Museum at North Higgins Lake. And those have both figured in previous episodes. And then I also, after my time working for the state, I did for a period, I worked for the Crawford County Library System, which included the Frederick Community Library, and also the Devereaux Memorial Library in Grayling, where I was the archivist for the library and genealogy specialist, and also worked the front desk at both libraries. So I was familiar with the library, and I did programs along with my regular work there, both prior to working for the library and then while I was there. And so my old director, Connie Meyer, who I've stayed in touch with over the years, she invited me to come do a program at the Frederick Library. And the program that I did was, if you listen to the podcast previously, I did my episode on DeWard, Michigan's last lumber boomtown, and so I did I did a presentation of it at least once before at Frederick. I think I may have did it in Grayling as well at the library there, and so I revisited that, including newer research that I've had done, and did that on Thursday, July 31. It was a nicely attended program. Frederick is a very small community, so whenever they get a decent-sized crowd of a dozen or more people for a program there, it's a good turnout, and that's what I had there. I had about 10, 12 people at the presentation. Not a huge showing, but for Frederick, that's a nice showing there. And it was a really nice program, and I knew a few of the faces there from my time living there before. And it was nice to share some of their local history. DeWard is only about 6 miles northwest of Frederick on the Manistee River. So I did the program in Frederick. I stayed overnight at some friends there. My friends Ben and Pam Carr, they used to own the Michigan Snowshoe Center in Roscommon, along with the Higgins Lake RV Park, a campground just a little east of Higgins Lake and North Higgins Lake State Park. And I've known them for a number of years. Ben introduced me to Sigurd Olson, who I would then revisit, of course, in Ely, Minnesota later in the tour. So it was nice to catch up with Ben and Pam. The next day, I headed just a few miles north to northeast of Gaylord and the east of the town of Vanderbilt and to the Pigeon River Country State Forest. Now, the Pigeon River Country is a fantastic state forest. It has a rich history going back to the lumber years of the late 19th century. There was a lot of logging that took place in that region there, and what's now composed of parts of Otsego County, Sheboygan County, and a small sliver of Montmorency County to the east, the far eastern side of the state forest. And in the state forest, it contains 3 rivers that go through there. The Pigeon River, of course, that the state forest is named for. A little bit of the Black River on the east side. And then also on the western edge of it, it was originally not part of the state forest, but became a part of it with a later addition called Green Timbers, and that is the Sturgeon River. And it's the Sturgeon Valley Road that comes east from Vanderbilt to go into the main part of the forest. And I stayed at a campground called Pine Grove State Forest Campground on the far northern bit of the top of the forest, which is actually closer to the town of Wolverine. So I think it's probably about 20 miles or more between the north and south boundaries of the state forest. So it's not a huge state forest when it comes to Michigan state forest areas, but it's a decent size, and that it's all one compact contiguous area, where most of the state forests in Michigan are broken up into kind of checkerboard type properties. They're not all contiguous together. But this one is great, and it's the home of Michigan's elk herd. They're not all in the state forest there, but that's where the majority of them are. It's got the three great rivers there, and Ernest Hemingway, when he was a young man, his family had a cottage on Walloon Lake over near Petoskey, so much further west, but it was not a long trip for him to get from Petoskey to the Pigeon River country and fishing, mostly on the Black River, but also did fish on the Pigeon and the Sturgeon River. And then they went through the period of, kind of creating the forest, replanting it. It went through a number of controversies. Oil and gas were discovered in the forest there, so there is unfortunately some wells in there. I say unfortunately, they did a nice kind of compromise where they do have the oil and natural gas drilling in there, but they do have, or that money goes into then the Natural Resources Trust Fund, and that goes into the purchasing of land, of recreation land in Michigan from that funding that they make from that. So there is a give back. And the forest has become a great recreational area over the years. Fishing, of course, as I mentioned, there's the elk. So elk hunting. There is a elk hunt every fall, late fall, early winter in Michigan. There's other hunting that happens in there. Former President Jimmy Carter, in I think it was 1986, went on a ruffed grouse hunt there in the Pigeon River Country State Forest and wrote about it. I've read his account in one of his books, and all of these will be featured in some episodes next season on the state forest. And I did bring my fishing gear with me, and I was going to do some trout fishing in the Pigeon River, and I didn't. Yes, I bought flies. I bought a license. I had a river report from some guides I know down in Grayling, but it was such a relaxing weekend. I just didn't get out on the river to fish. So I kind of kicked myself for that, but that doesn't mean I won't talk about fly fishing when I have the episodes on the Big Wild, as the Pigeon River country is known as. So that was nice, relaxing. I had a campfire every night. There was the Perseid meteor shower during that period, but I didn't see it. Unfortunately, this was a period where there was a lot of haze, a lot of smoke in the air from the Canadian wildfires that have been, happening all summer long, and it's been a pretty bad year for the air quality. And I just wasn't able to get a clear enough view to see any of the meteor showers. And they probably more happened after I went to bed each night. I stayed in my tent, which I have a nice setup. I've got a 4-man tent that I use just by myself. It's 7 feet tall, so I can stand up in there without having any problem. There's room to have a cot in there. I have a small table, like a just patio end table type thing in there, a stool, and I bring in my folding chair that I use, my camp chair, into the tent each night. And so I have a place to sit and read. I have a battery-powered light with a fan that I can hang from the top, so it's very comfortable in there. And that makes for a very pleasant time camping. I don't glamp, no glamorous camping, but I have comforts when I camp where I'm in a regular campground. And I mean, this was still rustic. There was pit toilets. They didn't even have a water pump, but it was a artesian well with a flowing well there for water. So I had water, I had the river, I had a campfire, and I had an outhouse nearby. It was nice for me, not for everybody, I understand, but it was summer, it was August, it was hot, so I didn't even have to worry about staying warm. So I did that for 3 nights, and then I moved on, stopped at Mill Creek in Mackinac City for a little bit on Monday, August 4th, before I crossed the Mackinac Bridge. And I visited with my friend Kyle Bagnall, who I've mentioned Kyle before. He is my person that I'm going to interview on the passenger pigeon, which will now be a special off-season episode. We've scheduled to interview here at the end of this month after he and his wife have a vacation, and then we'll have that later in October. But he is the head naturalist for the Mackinac State Historic Parks, which includes Mackinac Island State Park, Fort Mackinac and the downtown buildings there, the historic sites, along with all the natural areas on Mackinac Island, such as Sugarloaf and Arch Rock, and some just great other natural features and forests and wildlife in there. It's Colonial Michilimackinac, the old French fur post in Mackinac City that later became British. And then it's the historic Mill Creek Discovery Park, which is where I met him at. And it's the site of one of the early sawmills in Michigan that was dates back to the early 1780s and provided lumber for the construction of Fort Mackinac and the village buildings on Mackinac Island, and then was later used up through at least the 1820s. I don't have the book in front of me to give the exact date, but it was used for a number of years by a man named Michael Dousman, who was an American citizen who lived on Mackinac Island, and then also others that used it too for providing lumber for Mackinac Island. So they have this great recreated water-powered sawmill in use there, and I was able to see the demonstration of it. They had a female millwright there, not traditionally a female job, but there were women who did work in variety of jobs in the past that were always considered men only, but they weren't always. So it was nice to have a perspective of a female millwright and operating the saw. And it's a one-person show. She was able to do it all, getting the water wheel going and operating the saw. Now, in an operating sawmill, it probably would have been multiple people because also bringing the lumber off of the saw. But she did it on her own, and she had a great interpretation of it. Well, it was off across the bridge, and my first stop, which is always my first stop, was once I got onto US 2 coming west out of St. Ignace, was a stop at Leto's Pasties. And now there's always a great debate in the Upper Peninsula of who has the best pasties. And when you have a pasty, what do you put on it? Do you put ketchup on it? Do you put gravy on it? Or do you eat it plain? In my book, you can do any of them. I've had them all three ways. And now a Leto pasty to me does not need anything on it. But because, you travel in a car with it, at least I usually eat it that way, it's hard to have any sauce on there, any ketchup, any gravy on there. Ketchup, just a little bit on there, it might not be a big mess. But if you have gravy on there, that's going to be a dripping mess. You really need to have it on a plate. And they offer all three there at Leto's. And like I said, I usually choose plain. Frankly, they're so good you don't need them, need anything on it. And, some say, Leto's pasties aren't that great. You got to have this one. You got to have that one. I'm not here to say Leto's are the only pasty to have in the UP. But I had friends that introduced me to them many, many years ago. And to me, they're my favorite. And they're an iconic place, a white building on the side of US 2 with a red sign that says Leto's Pasties. And right now, US 2, or at least it was on August 4th, a lot of construction going on the road. Just like on US 23 between Mackinac City and Mill Creek, construction season in Michigan, whenever the weather's warm. Like that anywhere else, but, we always joke about it in Michigan about it's 2 seasons, construction season and winter. And I'm sure, again, other places say the same. But I got my pasty, and then I swung back because I had gone a little out of my way to go up to the little town of Trout Lake, which is kind of northwest of of St. Ignace. Geez, I forgot where I had been. But and it was originally a railroad crossroads in the middle of the forest on the border between Mackinac County and Chippewa County. And it was a perfect location for where two railroads crossed each other to put in a depot there. And then it was a place for the lumberjacks to get off the train to head to the area logging camps. And so it became a big lumber area there. And in 1914, I believe it was, I will be having the interview with them down the road here. But a doctor, a tuberculosis doctor, decided to build a sanitarium there on Trout Lake, which was the name. There's two lakes there, Trout Lake and Little Trout Lake. And he created Birch Lodge. And it was originally a tuberculosis sanitarium and resort. And unfortunately, the doctor died just shortly after it was opened. A patient's dog bit him, and he contracted rabies, and he died from rabies. Luckily, his brother was also a doctor, and he agreed to come and help out his sister-in-law and nephew to operate the sanitarium there. But the Northwoods of the Upper Peninsula was not for him. And he decided to return back to where he was at on the other side of Lake Michigan. And it was left then for them to open it up as a standard North Country resort, not a sanitarium. And it has been in operation, not all the time through, but off and on then from the late teens. I say 1914, I think that was when the land was purchased. 1915, it was built. And up until today, I mean, it was closed for a period in the 1960s, early 60s. A brick motel was built aside it. So they had the lodge, which still remains a 3-story wood-constructed lodge with a beautiful porch in front of it, and it looks out over the lake. There were some cabins there. Some of those cabins still remain, but they're not in use for people to stay at anymore. Some are storage buildings, and a later one that was built in the 1950s sits unused on the site. Oh, it would be great if they restored that cabin and could be like a family or, a multi-person, rental cabin for somebody to stay for a week, a family there or whatnot. So maybe sometime down the line there, Jim and Carol, the owners, will look at doing something like that. And I'll talk to them here for the season 3. I had technical issues while I was there. I couldn't get my microphone to work, which clearly it's working now, but I couldn't get it working the night I was supposed to interview Jim, the owner, for the podcast. So we're going to do it as a Zoom here before season 3 starts. So that was a nice 2-day stay there. I had one day where I just lounged around the lake there at their place. Oh, I also, that first night, that's where I had my pasty for my dinner. I had sat at an Adirondack chair with a little table there right on the lawn and sat out looking over the lake, listening to loons and eating my Upper Peninsula pasty, my Lado's pasty there, always a tradition. And if you don't know about pasties, that's a whole story in itself, brought to the Upper Peninsula by Cornish miners in both the iron and copper mines of the Upper Peninsula from Cornwall in England. And pasties are very popular, not just in Cornwall, but throughout England. It was a great food for miners going into the mines because they could carry it with them in a pocket or in their lunch box, lunch pail, and they could eat it then when they got their lunch break. So that translated to coming to Michigan, and it just spread in popularity. And I know they have them in Wisconsin, and I think they have them in Minnesota as well. But so I had my pasty there that night, and the next day I had smoked whitefish for lunch along with another, kind of platter there, crackers and cheese and summer sausage slice there. And because they have kayaks there, I took the kayak out on Trout Lake and into the channel to Little Trout Lake and around. Didn't hear any loons while I was out on the water, but it was just a beautiful day. Got sunburned. And I can't believe, though, I didn't go down to their beach that they have a little bit further down on the property and do a little swimming there. But I was on the water and in the water on the kayak, so that was nice. And again, sitting out in the evening, under the trees and the stars coming out, it was just very tranquil. And something I can't do when I do a week-long vacation, I try to put too much into it that I don't have a day of relaxation. So I did that day. But 2 days and or 2 nights and I had to be on the road again. And so it would have been Wednesday, August 6th, I guess we're looking at, if you want to follow along with a calendar. No need to. I'm not going to talk dates all the way through. But I was on my way to Wisconsin. Next stop, major stop, was going to be the Peshtigo Fire Museum in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, just outside Marinette and across the Menominee River from Menominee, Michigan. But that was about a 3-hour drive, so I made a couple of stops. One of them was actually not far from Trout Lake, and that was the Fibrin Quarry. And this is an old relic of various industrial days of the Upper Peninsula, and it was a large limestone quarry. And that limestone, it is part of the Niagara Escarpment. The landform that creates Niagara Falls over there in between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, it follows kind of an arc that goes up through Ontario. And here, looking at a map, if you see where the Bruce Peninsula is, that kind of divides Georgian Bay from the main part of Lake Huron, and then up to where Manitoulin Island is, and it swings over kind of through that island chain that includes Drummond Island, St. Joseph Island in Ontario, Drummond Island, Michigan, and back into the Upper Peninsula. And there's outcroppings along the way through the Upper Peninsula of where that limestone is. Well, Fibrin Quarry was one of those areas, and it was a good place for quarrying limestone. And that was used then in you process that with fire, and you make quicklime. And that lime then was used in the process for smelting iron ore to get it into the form of iron that is then used in mills, in steel mills and foundries to make steel, and for the steel industry here in the United States. And so places like in Fayette and the Garden Peninsula, another part of the Niagara Escarpment. But anyways, I had always been told about Fibrin Quarry, and so it was along my route on a back road to get me back to US 2, the main highway that goes across the southern part of the Upper Peninsula to between St. Ignace and then into, all the way across the Upper Peninsula. So I thought, well, I got to stop there. I hiked around a little bit, took some photos. I couldn't stay long because I had a 3-hour drive to get to Peshtigo. And so I took some, it was a great place to be. A lot of mosquitoes, though. That was something I found. I knew mosquito season was still going to be happening. We're now finally getting some cool down, but we certainly did not yet at that point. And actually, while I'm recording this week, it's today is September 4th, is that the Upper Peninsula and Wisconsin and Minnesota are having quite a bit of cool down, and I guess there were some snow flurries in Eagle Harbor on the Keweenaw Peninsula today. So yes, it is getting to that time of year there. So unfortunately, still plenty of mosquitoes when I went there. So I drove on. I drove through Manistee and had to see Paul Bunyan there along US 2, and did a little bit of a detour up off the road there, up past Indian Lake State Park and to another very small state park called Palm Books State Park. And that's named after the Palms family and the Book family. And both of them were industrialists in Detroit, Francis Palms, and then, I don't remember Book's first name, but Both of them were lumbermen and did other things. They did a lot of development in Detroit. Well, they owned adjoining properties up there in the Upper Peninsula. And on the properties there that they owned is where Big Spring is located, correctly known by its indigenous name, Kitch-Iti-Kipi. And it has a naming for what that means, but it's the Big Spring. And it is that it's a 30-foot by 40-foot spring, basically a pond, and there is a cable-driven raft. You have to pull on the cable on it, and it pulls you across the pond there. And there's a big observation area, an open viewing of the bottom of the spring there. That you can see where all the water is bubbling up through the sand, and there's some enormous trout down in that water. There's no fishing in it there, so these fish can get nice and big there, and they feed off all the native vegetation and flies and other insect larvae down there in the water there. So they get nice and big, and no fisherman can get to it, but it's a huge tourist attraction. And going in early August, I knew there'd be a lot of people there, but oh man, there was far too many people and the line was so long, I just didn't have time to wait in line to go across on the raft there. I've been there before. It's very nice to do, especially I think I was there in September and again in November, 2 different times there, and I was basically the only one. I think on the November time, I was the only person there on the raft. Hauled myself across, stopped to take pictures of the water below, and it was really neat. But this time around, there were hundreds of people there. And and people with their kids, they definitely want to show them that. So that's absolutely fine. So if you want to go in the summertime, just expect a wait there. Better yet, go any other time when it's open. I have a feeling they don't plow the road that far back in the wintertime, but probably early, in the springtime, and then in the fall, it's pretty beautiful there. And in the fall, if you catch it at the right time, you got a lot of fall color around it. So it was out of Michigan now and into Wisconsin. And just shortly after I crossed the Menominee River from Menominee to Marinette, Wisconsin, just down US 41, I think about 6 miles out of Marinette is the little town of Peshtigo. And Peshtigo had an important event that took place on October 8th, 1871, but it was far overshadowed by something else happening at the same time along in the Great Lakes. And that was the one that happened in Peshtigo was the Great Peshtigo Fire. And it was a devastating wildfire. We try to get out of the forest fire terms now because they don't only happen in the forest, but a lot of it is the cutover after the forests are gone. But it was a devastating wildfire and that burned through the area, and it was usually it was a number of fires that just kind of burned together. 1871 was a terrible drought year, a lot of with the lumber. And I talked about it on a previous episode, Fire Follows the Axe, where when the trees are gone, it dries. And of course, you have all that slash there, and that burns easily. And a lot of this area they tried to farm. So there was farmers clearing the land by burning the brush. And so these fires were burning, and it was very dry, it was windy, the fires burned together into one giant conflagration, and it destroyed the town of Peshtigo, along with numerous other small communities, and it burned up into the Door Peninsula across Green Bay. There was actually other fires that were burned up that way, but they're all considered part of the same fire. Across the Menominee River into the Upper Peninsula, and more than 1,600 people perished in the fire, and it was the heaviest loss in lives of forest fires, of wildfires in the United States ever. But at the same time that Peshtigo was burning, so was Chicago, the Great Chicago Fire. So Chicago, it got the headlines. It was the bigger city, the bigger town that burned. And it had more damage in money-wise, but it was smaller in depth-wise. And then the next day, the conflagration continued across Lake Michigan in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan. And that's a whole nother episode, not covering it here, but that was the Great Michigan Fire of 1871. And that was the largest one in area-wise of acreage of square miles burning. But so I went to the Peshtigo Fire Museum, and they had a very, very moving exhibits there on it, and showing artifacts that survived the fire, melted glass, iron and steel tools, nails that melted together into mass balls of metal. So unfortunately, it was a somber place, and adjacent to the building that the museum is in, which was an old church, not the church that was originally on that location. Originally, it was the Catholic church, and that burned in the fire. And then they built a new Catholic church there, and that later burned, and they moved then, but not in that fire, but another time. But they moved another church from across the Peshtigo River over across the bridge and onto that site, and then that was used as the third Catholic church there for a while, and then later it became the fire museum when a new church was built. No, I'm sorry, that was the Presbyterian church then that moved over there and was used there. But there's a cemetery next to it. Now, the cemetery existed prior to the fire, but then that was where most of the losses, the deaths that, where they found remains in Peshtigo, where they buried them, was there at that cemetery. And then they have a mass grave of where there was people they could not identify. They buried them. And there's stories there of some of the people that were lost, those that they could identify, and they know how they died, how they passed. They have markers for them there. So it's a somber place, but it's an important place to go for the history, because we know not all of history is happy. And we have to reinforce that all of the time when there are people out there now, especially today, that only want the good stuff to be remembered and not the bad things. But as a professional historian, I know we have to tell all of the stories. The good, the bad, the embarrassing, the shameful, but also the tragic, such as the fires here. And that's one of two fires I covered on the trip. So from Peshtigo, I went up to the northwest, up into the Nicolet portion of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. It's managed as one large national forest, but it's really two separate units, and they were originally created as two separate national forests. And the Nicolet National Forest is located kind of in the northeastern part of Wisconsin, closer to the Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And around the town of Lakewood, which is the headquarters of one of their ranger districts, is a place called, and let me make sure I have this right, it's Cathedral Pines State Natural Area, and it's in the Nicolet unit of the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. And it's a 40-acre old-growth forest that was originally owned by William Holt, one of the major lumbermen in that part of Wisconsin. And also he was involved with a tractor company doing a lot of log haulers in the forest. And you may have been on or seen a Holt bulldozer, a tractor like a Caterpillar tractor. But he and his wife Lucy, were responsible for saving this 40-acre tract of old-growth white pine. And it's a very nice place there. It's off the beaten path a little bit, off of a dirt road that drives through the area there. And there's a nice hiking trail up through there, and it's on the side of a ridge, so you got to do some up and downs on there. It's good for the legs that way. But again, lots of mosquitoes. And it's a small site, so it was only a short visit there. And not far from there, I stayed the night at a place called Boot Lake National Forest Campground, a nice national forest campground. It was a little too busy for me. It was all paved through there, and lots of people camping there because they have a nice lake there, and the lake is actually shaped like a boot, hence the name. Not quite Italy-like, but you can tell it looked enough like a boot. So I stayed there overnight, had a nice little campsite there. And then that morning I got up early enough and I drove up to the nearby town of Leona, that's north of there. And in Leona, they have a really neat attraction there called the Lumberjack Steam Train and Camp 5 Museum. Now, this was property that was once owned by the Connor Lumber Company in the early 20th century, and it was where Connor Lumber Company's Camp 5, their a logging camp, was located at. And they used the camp for a couple of years for logging the area. And when they were done logging there, the Connor Lumber Company turned it into a farm. And it then became the company farm to provide food for the lumberjacks, the shanty boys, and the rest of his camps. And so W.H. Connor was his name, who had the lumber company there. And they raised cattle there, hogs. They have the hog slaughterhouse still there, the slaughterhouse. They probably used it for cattle as well, but they have it set up as an exhibit for hogs in there. They grew potatoes and onions and rutabagas and beets, and they had hay and wheat growing there. They had horses there while we were there because but I suspect that they probably kept the horses when they weren't in use in the camp there to kind of recuperate and go out to pasture so they could build up their strength again. Oh, they also grew oats there, I remember now, for the horses too. So it was really neat. And they have, from the town of Leona out the couple miles out to where the museum is, they have a steam locomotive because they actually had their own logging trains that went out to their various camps and to haul lumber in to the main railroad line in Leona. And I don't know if they had a mill in Leona or not, or they took from the main lines elsewhere to the sawmills. As what both ways could have been typical at the time period. But that was a really neat experience to ride on a steam locomotive. And I've been able to do that a few times in my life. Well, I worked at Greenfield Village for 3 years, and we had the train there. I actually got to drive the locomotive once, which was a really cool experience. But so this was nice to be able to do that. And it was, again, another hot day. And it was I was out there from about... I think from 10 a.m. to 2 o'clock, I think I was out there that day. So it was, or a little bit later than that, maybe 3. But thankfully it wasn't a long drive to my next and final stop for that day, and that was Rhinelander, Wisconsin. And in Rhinelander, they have a place called Pioneer Park Historical Complex. And Pioneer Park is kind of right in the center of town, and they've got a number of museums there. And one of the museums is their logging museum, and it opened in 1932, and it is the oldest logging or lumber history museum in the United States. Hartwick Pines Logging Museum, I thought, was number 2 when it opened in 1935, but turns out there's another one in Wisconsin, in Eau Claire, that opened in 1934. I think that's at the Chippewa Valley Museum, their Paul Bunyan Logging Museum there. So those were all very, very neat museums there to visit. They also have a CCC museum there. They have a narrow gauge railroad locomotive and cars there out on display. There's a couple of other museums in there, a boat museum, a train museum. Trying to think, there was what else? I'm at a loss for a moment that was there, but mainly I was there to see the logging museum and the CCC museum. And both of those will figure into episodes. Oh, and of course, it's the home of the hodag. And I did the What the Heck is a Hodag episode while I was on the road. I recorded it the night after Rhinelander because I didn't have good internet connection at the hotel in Rhinelander, so I waited till I was in Hinckley the next night to post the episode. But that was a great place. And yes, the hodag, the legendary fake mythical creature, as all of them were, that were told as stories in the logging camps. Or maybe you believe in the cryptoids and maybe it's not fake to you. I won't judge on that. But anyways, this one was created by a couple of guys in Rhinelander, and they had great stories about it. And they claimed it to be a real creature that they had caught live, and they showed it at the fair and at other places, but it was always under shadows and poor lighting, and so people couldn't really see that it wasn't alive. But so it was a kind of a good old P.T. Barnum trick. There's a sucker born every minute type of thing. But so that contributes to the kind of the mythology of logging, and I did that little episode. And the next day was another 3+ hour drive, going across Wisconsin, stopping in St. Croix Falls, Wisconsin, at the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway headquarters and visitor center. And the St. Croix River was one of the great logging rivers there in the Wisconsin-Minnesota area. Along with what's also part of the National Riverway is the Namakagon River. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but up in Wisconsin. And it was a series of rivers used for driving logs down the rivers, and then you got past what they called the dells of the St. Croix, which was St. Croix Falls and Taylor Falls, which was in Minnesota, right across the river. And then you came past that, there was a gorge there, and they could have boat traffic going up as far as the dells there. And then they rafted logs on these large rafts down to Stillwater, Minnesota, which is just above the mouth of the St. Croix onto the Mississippi River, and even down into the Mississippi River, floating logs down as far down as Dubuque, Iowa, where they had sawmills, and even as far as St. Louis, Missouri. But Stillwater had sawmills, and then Dubuque and elsewhere along the rivers there they did too. But so that was the early lumber industry in that part. It didn't go to the Great Lakes. It went to the Mississippi River, and that was then to St. Louis and the gateway to the west. So the Great Lakes lumber didn't just go into the Great Lakes. So that was neat to see all of that there. And I need to speed this up because we're already at 47 minutes, and I'm only halfway through my tour. So the next day was that same day, I stopped at the Snake River Fur Post in Pine City, Minnesota. It's a Minnesota Historical Society site, and it was originally a Northwest Fur Company post in the early 1800s. And so they talk about the relations between the indigenous people, the Ojibwe, and the fur traders. And then it was up to the Hinckley Fire Museum in Hinckley, Minnesota. And that was September 1894. So 23 years later, after the Peshtigo fire, was the biggest fire in Minnesota, and that included 418 deaths in a fairly large area that had numerous towns that were destroyed, including Hinckley, destroyed completely. And then the next day, I did a little bit more driving, and I hit the Mille Lacs Indian Museum on the Mille Lacs in Minnesota. That's a Minnesota Historical Society site, and it's on the site of an Ojibwe reservation, Indian reservation there, and it has another good stories of the indigenous people of Minnesota, and with Manoomin, wild rice, and then the tourism of Mille Lacs there, the trading post that was there that was originally used for the reservation, and then it became one for the tourism, and it's also part of the museum now as both an exhibit and a really great store on indigenous artwork, not just of local Minnesota, but throughout United States and into the Pacific Northwest of Canada as well. Kept driving and made it to one of my main sites to visit was the Forest History Center in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, the third Minnesota Historical Society site I would visit. And this one I first went to in 2001, and it is their main museum for both lumber and forestry history there. So they have recreated logging camp from 1906, Wanigan, a floating raft on the Mississippi River because the Grand Rapids there was on the Mississippi. There's now a big reservoir there from a dam, so the rapids are long gone. There is a lot of talk on forestry, the replanting of the forest. There's a forester's cabin and a fire tower. Well, I didn't go up the fire tower this time because it's more than 100 feet up, and that's a lot of steps to go up, and my hip and my knees would have been really screaming for that. So I passed on that, and probably my heart too. But I talked to some great people there, the director of the site, a couple of his interpreters, and so they'll definitely be figuring into Minnesota lumber history podcast episodes. And then I drove up to Hibbing, Minnesota, and this was more of a social stop. I have a friend, Dave Hill, who used to live in Michigan, in the northeastern part of the Lower Peninsula, and I got to know him when I lived in Frederick, and he and his wife and daughter live in Hibbing now. So he showed me around the area, and Hibbing is Bob Dylan's hometown, so I saw his childhood home. There's a big sign for him in front of the Hibbing High School. And then we went to the Hull Rust Mahoning mine. It is the largest open pit iron mine in the world. And wow, is it stark. Fibrin Quarry was one thing. It was not really deep, that one, because the limestone was so much onto the surface. But the open pit mine, because these were areas where they once had shaft mines and going deep into the ground. Well, instead of doing that, they just started digging out these huge pits. And they had this great observation area, and you could see this pit, this mine goes on for miles. And it looks like, the landscape of Mars, of how we imagine it. Red from the red dust from the iron ore in there, and just very stark. So from there, I stayed overnight in nearby Chisholm, Minnesota, and the next day I got to Ely. And Ely, Minnesota was kind of my optimal place to get to. It was my turnaround point, and I stayed 3 days at the Superior National Forest campground called South Kawishawee, and that's a word to easily mistake. I stayed at the same campground in 2005, and Ely is really it's an outdoor paradise. It's the mecca for if you're a canoeist, because it is the gateway to the Boundary Waters canoe wilderness area, and it is where you would go off to onto this roadless area, going through all these lakes and rivers and portages, and it's fantastic. This was where Sigurd Olson lived. And although I could not get to see Sigurd Olson's home and writing cabin in town, or his listening point, his retreat, his cabin on Burnside Lake, they were closed. They're only done when there's volunteers available for tours. And in that week I was there, I wasn't there on the day that they had tours available. I left on the Wednesday. They had them open on Thursday, but I had my schedule. I had to get back home that weekend, so I could not stay any longer. But it's just, there's wolves there. There's the International Wolf Center, which is a great educational place for learning about the timber wolf or the gray wolf. There's the North American Bear Center, and Lynn Rogers, who was a longtime bear biologist, and I remember reading about him in the National Geographic World magazine when I was a little kid, and seeing pictures of him in the wintertime holding a bear cub. And when he worked he worked with the, I don't know if it was the Fish and Wildlife Service or with the U.S. Forest Service, but he was based there out of Ely. So when he retired, he started the North American Bear Center to educate people about bears, particularly black bears, because that's what's there in Minnesota, in the Great Lakes region, what we have here in Michigan, but also the grizzly bears, the brown bears, which are basically the same. Some will probably tell me that's not true, but polar bears and other bears here in North America. So I didn't have time to frankly, also I was running a little tight on budget. I couldn't afford to go to either one of those sites. But I had been to the International Wolf Center when I was there in 2005. But while I was there, I got some hiking in a number of places. I did get into the, right on the edge of the boundary waters where the canoe put-in points are to get into the boundary waters at two different places. And I really got to enjoy it. But at my campground, I heard loons there every night, just like I did practically everywhere I camped throughout the trip. But the one thing I didn't hear this time is I didn't hear any wolves at night when I was in my tent. The last time I was there in 2005, two different trips in Minnesota, I could lay awake at night and I could hear wolves howling some miles away. And the area has really built up a lot more people now. And I don't know if that's the reason why, but I didn't hear any wolves that time. Also, I didn't have a visit to my campsite, which I did the previous time, of any Canada jays or gray jays. These are related to blue jays, but they don't have the tufts on their head, and they're gray instead of blue, of course. But they are the friendliest birds, and they will come down and they will feed right out of your hand. Or, if you put a little bit of food on your picnic table, if you have your food out and it's unattended, they'll come and steal it away. The lumberjacks called them camp robbers for that reason. And so they're quite characters to watch, but I didn't see any of those when I was hiking. I didn't see a pine marten like I did the last time around. So I was a little disappointed there about the experiences I didn't have from the first time, but I had those the first time, so I'm happy about it. And I definitely want to go back to Ely again, and if I can, try to plan it better to when the listening point is open. But I have to say, their website, they didn't announce any tours until June, and I had to already have my vacation scheduled with work back in January and February. So by the time I had my dates figured out when I'd be there, I still didn't know if they'd have tours or not. When I found out, it was too late. So I hope that they can do a speedier job in posting when tours are available. And I understand when you're volunteers, it's tough to do that. And their main job is to preserve the records and of Sigurd Olson and his writings. But there's a lot of us who fell in love with his writing over the years. And to have been able to have visited that site, that would have been the top experience I had for the entire trip. And hopefully another time I'll definitely get to Ely again. And one last thing I did in Ely, there's another great place there, and that's Will Steger's Mucklucks. And Will Steger was a Arctic explorer. He was based out of Ely, and he made mucklucks, which are a version of the Inuit, the northern indigenous peoples of footwear for living up in the Arctic area. And they're very warm boots. His modern ones, they're wool, or they're leather, and lined with a wool and a synthetic lining, but with rubber soles. And they're extremely warm. And I couldn't afford to buy a pair while I was there, but I got sized for them. So now I know the size I need, and I can order them online when I can afford them. I can't afford them right now, though. They're not terribly expensive, but they're also not something I can buy with a 1 week's paycheck. I need to be able to plan for it because with other, living expenses. But anyway, so the next, unfortunately, after 3 nights, I had to move on from Ely, and it was time to head home. And I drove across what they call the Arrowhead of Minnesota, the area north of Lake Superior, and I cut down through areas that had been logged in the over history of the Superior National Forest, stopped at a site that's interpreted of a old logging campsite, and I was there in 2005, and it was a nice wide open area, and you could see the archaeological remains of where camp buildings were located. 20 years later, it is so overgrown there that you can't see anything. But they do have the pathway mode, and they have interpretive signs, although the signs look new in 2005. They need replacement now. But it was nice to see that. Oh, and going back to Ely. Ely was also a mining area. They had on the Vermilion Iron Range, which was smaller area than the Mesabi Range that goes through Hibbing. But they have a Pioneer mine, iron mine, that's open to the public to visit. Now, the mine isn't in operation. It hasn't been since the 60s. But you can tour it, and there's a heritage center in there. There's also a couple of other museums there to visit, and I'll have more on that when I have my episode on Ely. But anyway, so I drove through to, and there was lumber in the Ely and Winton area, the nearby town, which was a big lumber center. And actually the St. Croix Lumber Company camp that is interpreted that I went by in the community of Isabella, they hauled their logs all the way to Winton. Now, it was by river. There's a river that flows through there. But that's quite a ways that they sent their logs to the mill up in Winton on, I can't remember the name of the lake. It was a big lake they have up there, and they had a big mill there. But anyway, so they sent their lumber all that way and then shipped it from rail from there. But so I got down to the Lake Superior shore, and I stayed the night at Gooseberry Falls State Park. And in the 1930s, the park was developed. A lot of waterfalls through there, but this fantastic sandstone stonework done by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And there will be an episode on that one. And it's beautiful. I learned about that park a number of years ago. And I'd actually stopped there in 2005, coming back on the same trip, but I didn't know about the history of it. So I was up at the visitor center and kind of looked around in there, but I didn't really explore much of it. And CCC was certainly on my radar because of the CCC Museum at Hartwick Pines, but I hadn't looked past Michigan at that time. And later in 2014, I did a session at a conference on the CCC and the Great Lakes, and Gooseberry Falls was one of my main focus for Minnesota. I kind of picked a park or an area in each of the Great Lakes states, and Gooseberry Falls was the state park in Minnesota I looked at, and so I knew I had to get back. And this time around, I camped there, and I went to and photographed every building I could find of the old CCC work. I think I may have missed one that's located on the other side of the highway. Most of the park is on the south side of this highway that along the shore. And then there's some areas on the north side of it where the old visitor center was located, and some other areas there. But and hiking, the North Country Trail goes through there, the Superior Hiking Trail, as the segment there in Minnesota is. But so that was all nice. I got to hike. I got to enjoy CCC work and a night on Lake Superior. And there were no mosquitoes. The breeze coming off of Lake Superior prevented the mosquitoes from really congregating anywhere. And there were flies, but not the biting flies, stable flies that are usually bad to have along the Lake Superior shore. These were kind of like the outdoor version of house flies. They were annoying, but they weren't, blood sucking, or, they didn't wound you like a black fly or a stable fly did. So the next day, it was a trip around through Duluth and Superior, Wisconsin, and it was kind of my bad day of the trip. I wasn't feeling great. I get periodic headaches I've had since I was a child, and I had one that day. So instead of making it all the way to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I was going to make some stops, and I was going to get to the Western UP for the night. I instead stayed not far into Wisconsin, camped in the Chequamegon National Forest, which was not my intended plan, but I camped at a nice little campground called Perch Lake, and beautiful scenery. And I'll have to post some pictures that I still have on my camera, not my cell phone, but my actual digital camera that I haven't uploaded yet, and beautiful place to camp at, and I'll share that on my Facebook page. And that was very peaceful there at Perch Lake, and it was a good place to kind of just relax, and I got over my headache. And then next day I camped, or I hiked in an area called Drummond Woods, and it was an old growth white pine forest. A lot of logging had taken place there. The North Country Trail runs through there, so I hiked a little bit on the North Country Trail, and I was feeling good that day, and so I drove. I did stop up in Ashland, Wisconsin at an original location to stop at, the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center, which is a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service from the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest, the National Park Service, because north of that area, up in Bayfield, is the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore, and there's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, because there's a National Wildlife Refuge in the area. There's the indigenous people. There's a couple of Ojibwe reservations in the area. I think one is called Red Cliff and the other one is Bad River. And so there's two of them there, and they were having a meeting of elders there that day at the visitor center. And finally, the Wisconsin Historical Society, Wisconsin's history organization there. And I actually have a long ago coworker from Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village, Christian Overland, who's now the director of the Wisconsin Historical Society. So I'll name drop a little bit there. So Christian, if you're listening, hello. I know we're Facebook friends, though we don't talk often. So maybe you've come across the podcast here. But anyways, they have great exhibits there. And this was the second location where I saw a nice exhibit on manoomin, on the wild rice, very important in the northern Great Lakes with the indigenous people. And it would not be the last place I would visit with that. I would also visit it or see it at the, sorry, I take that back. It was the fourth place, because at Snake River Fur Post, they also had an exhibit on manoomin there, although they were more focused on the fur, but they also talked about the food as well. So the last place I visited was continue driving that day. I drove as far across the Upper Peninsula as I could, but I stopped in Watersmeet, Michigan at the Ottawa National Forest Visitor Center. And again, they had nice exhibits there on manoomin, and that's an area not too far away is Lac Vieux Desert, or Lac Vieux Desert. It's a combination of the French and the Ojibwe, or the Anishinaabe. And that's an area there where they live. They have a lot of wild rice going on in that area as well. And so they had a nice exhibit on there. And that's also near where Sylvania Wilderness is, a great area for canoeing. A lot of lakes that are interconnected there with portages or channels between them. It's not the Boundary Waters. It's not Temagami up in Ontario where I've canoed before. But it is certainly a place where you can get away, great for a couple of days out away from it all. And I haven't been there, but it's on my bucket list of up north things to do. And so I continued driving, and I drove until about 8 o'clock that night, and I got to Big Knob State Forest Campground. And that was always intended to be my last stay in the Upper Peninsula and on the trip. And it's a nice little campground, state forest campground on the shores of Lake Michigan, on the North Shore, on the UP side. And it's a good place to catch sunrises on Lake Michigan as opposed to sunsets as you see in the Lower Peninsula. But I got there. It was late. I decided, I did not want to set up my tent. Rain was in the forecast. It was actually light showers while I was getting in there. So I slept in the car that night, which is good because there was a thunderstorm that came off the lake overnight. I had very little bad weather the entire time. The biggest storm I had was when I was in Hinckley and I was staying in a hotel. And so I heard it against the window in the middle of the night. But anyway, so I stayed there overnight. This was the night of August 15th. And August 16th, was my last day, and it was time to drive home. So I drove the hour, not quite an hour, to St. Ignace, stopped at the Mackinac Bridge at Bridgeview Park to get a view of the mighty Mac. And it's always great for me when I'm crossing the bridge going north. I always hate crossing it going south. Means I'm going back home and going back to work. And, someday I would love to be able to just choose to cross the bridge when I wanted to head south, live in the UP. I don't know if I'll be able to, but that's my goal for retirement. So I drove home there. I stopped in Gaylord, visited with a friend for a short bit. And then I just headed south and got back to Chelsea that evening or late afternoon. And it was the end of the trip. It was great. I gathered so much information on the episode or for the episode there. And hour and 9 minutes. So we got to get done here. So it was great. And I'm already looking forward to the next season. And right now it's going to be another 15 episode season. I think that's going to be my originally was going to be 12 episodes a season, but I think 15. And so I'm going to do a number of episodes here on based on my trip, and I couldn't tell you what they all are yet. That's still just at the very preliminary planning right now. But the one thing is, when I was at Ottawa National Forest, the ranger I was talking to invited me to speak at some point on the history of the Ottawa National Forest for them, because I told them I was looking at doing episodes on it. So I probably won't do that next year, because next year my podcast tour will take me across the border to Ontario and look at the forests on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes, mainly around Lake Huron, both north and east of it. But 2027, I know I'm going back to the Upper Peninsula more in depth. Maybe I'll get into Wisconsin and Minnesota, but most likely I won't. So that could be a good time to do that programming. And so that's the one thing I want to let you know. I'm available for programs. If you're listening to this and you think, geez, I'd love to learn more, and maybe Rob can share some of his information with my group, well, yes, contact me on my email, and I'll include it in the episode notes here. But it is rob.northcountryhistory@gmail.com. So you can contact me that, and we could potentially set up something. I'll be doing a program in October for the Michigan Botanical Society's Huron Valley chapter in Ann Arbor. So I do these programs now and then, not a lot of them. It's just part of this side gig I do. But so I'm gathering this information for all of that. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank my supporters who have signed on to support the North Country History podcast financially. It's not a lot of money that they give each month, but it helps, and it pays for some of the different things that I do here, podcast fees, but also it contributes some for being able for me to afford to do a trip like this, a tour. And so I have just a few people so far signed up, and so there's plenty of room for more if you're interested. But I want to thank especially Robin Westfall, Melinda Carricker, Margaret Zapolsky, Steve Emmerich, and Cindy Kruger for all helping me out as a supporter of the North Country History with Rob Burg podcast. If you want to support, all you have to do is follow this the podcast link that I will post on the episode notes. It's not one that I can easily read here on the air. You can go to that link and sign up that way, or to my podcast website, North Country History with Rob Burg.buzzsprout.com, and hit that support button, and that'll go to the same website there, or webpage, and you can sign up that way to support the podcast and help me continue to do tours like this. So I want to thank you for listening in this season, and for listening in here for a little bit longer episode to hear my wrap up on the podcast tour. And look forward to some special bonus episodes here through the fall into the early winter. I know I'll have at least 2 I have both Kyle Bagnall on the passenger pigeon and Bruce Lynn on lumber, lakes, and lighthouses, episodes that were postponed from this season. And we'll be doing those here in the fall in October, November period. And I'm probably going to throw in 1 or 2 more. And then we'll have the season 3 start off in early January. I don't have a date on it yet. I don't have a schedule for it yet. But it will take off in January, and we'll run, like I said, about 15 episodes. So thanks again for listening. And keep on listening. Enjoy the episodes that still remain, the bonus ones, and then into season 3. Bye. North Country History with Rob Burg is hosted, written, and produced by Rob Burg. Music is Crack o' Dawn, performed by Reveille, licensed through Soundstripe. Follow North Country History with Rob Burg on YouTube and on Facebook at Rob Burg Environmental Historian.